to march me across a stage singing Rule Britannia. But of my ancestry, listen what they taught me. Tarzan ruled the jungles of Africa. So that's why I'm saying, teach the children the truth which they hide. So therefore, Father, they'll see with honor, respect, and pride. Teach them that Africa is where civilization began. Teach them that Africa was the cradle of creation. Teach them ancient Egyptians were all Africans. Teach them that Plato and Socrates taught African philosophies. Teach them that poetry, music, and art was Africa's own from the start. Teach them Africans were the very, very first men to walk on this universe. Teach them. Teach them, teach them. Teach the children. Teach them, teach them. Oh, how they glorified Europe's past in the books they gave me. But they said my people were barbarous, no culture, no history. Africans were savage. We had no heritage until they came and preached Christianity. What a lie. So that's why I'm saying, teach the children the truth they must learn. Who are the vulture, stole of culture and call it their own. Teach them that Africa is the land of King Solomon, who married Makeda, the queen of Sheba and African. Teach them Christianity belongs to us historically. Teach them Islamic culture came from Axum in Africa. Teach them Bilal of Islam came from Kush, he was Egyptian. Teach them the Holy Quran clearly states that Moses was an African. Teach them. Teach them, teach them. Teach the children. Teach them, teach them. We have been misled, we've been underfed, made slaves and exploited. We all have been fed with lies, Europeanized and taken for granted. But a change is near, I could see the sign. Let's prepare your children and mine to take their rightful place at that point in time. So that's why I'm saying, teach the children the things they never told. Like the contribution by the African to the modern world. But tell them that Africa is not the land that she used to be because of the plunder up to this 20th century. Teach them of Mansa Musa, that great African conqueror. Teach them King Minos of old built the first navy in this world. Teach them the year's calendar was first written in Africa. Teach them how Europeans stole and still thief in Africa go. Teach them. Teach them, teach them. The little children. Teach them, teach them. You got African philosophies. Teach them that poetry, music, and art was Africa's own from the start. Teach them Africans were the very, very first men to walk on this universe. Teach them. Teach them, teach them. Teach the children. Teach them, teach them. Oh, how they glorified Europe's past in the books they gave me. But they said my people were barbarous, no culture, no history. Africans were savage. We had no heritage until they came and preached Christianity. What a lie. So that's why I'm saying, teach the children, teach the children.
Mr. Watts, he's armed himself. Shots. Shots. Watch it. Tear gas. Live rounds. Also, I can see that.
Justice for Quindon! Everyone is a boxer, man. Why can't put in a boxer, man, to do that?
But since my question there, no, you come on the East Coast.
You listen to me.
Right? No, you come on the East Coast.
You listen to me.
You gotta listen to me too, man.
I am listening to you.
Mr. Desmond Hoyt. Mr. Hoyt, once again, welcome to Carib Nation. This is my third interview with you in 2 years, so you're a regular. I'm going to ask you some tough questions today because the situation in Guyana demands tough questions and some serious answers. Let me ask you straight up. Are you embarrassed that 3 times over the last 9 months, CARICOM officials have had to go into Guyana to help to bring some solution to problems you have there?
No, I wouldn't say that I'm embarrassed. I would have thought that the CARICOM leaders saw an opportunity to demonstrate the interconnection between Guyana and the rest of CARICOM. That, you know, we're talking about being a region. We're talking about people having common interests, moving towards a single market, a single economy, and in a sense, a single identity, you know. And I do not find it offensive in any way that they should try to help. And I would be the last person to say to CARICOM leaders, don't come into Guyana and try to assist in a very difficult situation.
But don't you think it's a reflection that the Guyanese people, the Guyanese political leaders, cannot solve their own problems?
Well, it's not that we can't solve it, but I think that the CARICOM leaders felt that they could play a role. You know, you can solve problems in many ways. I mean, the problems that we had and still have, we're heading towards a serious resolution through conflict, you know, and the question is whether that was the best way. The CARICOM leaders proposed another way of dealing with the problems and the conflicts.
Let me hold on to that word you use, conflict, yes, because you're quite right in describing the situation as one of conflict. That conflict manifests itself not just politically, but racially. Yes. And I think that's very dangerous.
Yes.
We have a situation in Guyana where the country is racially polarized. Mm-hmm. Do you think that we can continue to deal with politics the same way as we've been doing all the time, and solve the problem that way?
No, absolutely not. First of all, I think that we have to acknowledge that we have a multiplicity of problems, of which race is a prominent one. Many people still deny that you have a racial problem, and therein lies a problem. Another problem, if we acknowledge that there's a racial problem, then we have to face this problem frontally and in a very intelligent way try to see how we could so structure our constitution and our internal social and other arrangements so as to minimize, if not completely eliminate, this racial problem. And that is what we're grappling with right now.
I am not one of those persons who like to harp on 28 years of PNC rule, but I've got to ask you this question pointedly. I was in Guyana and I saw the demonstrations immediately after the election, and it was clear to me that the majority of your supporters, who are African Guyanese, were demonstrating against more than just election rigging. They were demonstrating against their condition, their economic and social condition. And I want to ask you, how do you feel that your government, which was supported by the majority of Black people for 28 years, now you're out of office, and that they are in the position they're in economically and socially?
Well, let's get back and look at this thing in perspective. You know, they were demonstrating not only against what they perceived to be massive manipulation of the election results, but against bad governance, victimization, discrimination, joblessness, which is very high, particularly among young people. So it's a very complex situation there. Now, bear in mind that in 1985, when I took office, the economy was in a very bad way, and the whole objective had to be to restore the economy from one of stagnation to one of growth and the development of opportunities for employment, for investment, and things like that. And we started to do that. In the 5 years, we did a remarkable turnaround, which put the Guyana economy on a firm basis for what I would call a rapid takeoff. We got the growth rate going again at what, 6-7%. We got investments coming in from United States, from Canada, from United Kingdom, continental Europe, and to me, most satisfying of all, from the Caribbean. And prior to that, no Caribbean businessman was going to touch us with a 10-foot pole. And so we had the policies and we had the programs and we had created a climate which would have created the kind of economic situation which would have given the Guyanese people an opportunity to really move forward and develop themselves. Unfortunately, those policies were not carried out by the PPP when they came in. And it's a fact that between 92, when they got into office, and now, there has not been another major significant investment in the country. And that is why today we are in economic crisis. So we've gone right back where the first half of this year we had negative growth. In other words, you've gone full circle.
Let me press you on this question.
Yes.
You've said that the People's National Congress, your party, is not a black people party. It's an all-inclusive party.
That's what we...
However, the majority of your support, the bulk of your support...
Absolutely, the same as the majority of the PPP supporters are Indians.
Are Indians. Yes. But it seems to me that African people in Guyana have some special problems.
Yes.
That may not be necessarily the same with the Indian Guyanese. Yeah. What I want to find out from you is whether your party intends at any point, whether in opposition or if you get back in government, to tackle the problems, these particular problems of African Guyanese in that country.
Well, let me put it this way, that no government, if it wants to succeed, can present itself as being a government of part of a country. And I think that's the mistake that the PPP has been making.
Okay.
I think the first principle of government is that when a political party is elected to office, it becomes the government of all the people. And it has to be seen to be non-partisan, to be even-handed, to be just.
Right.
And that is what a People's National Congress government will try to do. Now, that does not mean that in terms of development, one does not look at or cannot look at particular areas, whether they be geographical, there are some parts of the country that are depressed, whether it be ethnic, because bear in mind that you have large numbers of poor Indians. People talk sometimes if every Indian is rich, every Indian has a big bite. It's not true. They suffer from the same bad housing, bad roads, drainage, and so on, as black people do. The black people being the urban people, it is more prominent, it's more easily recognized, and so on. So what I'm saying is that we have to look at all sections of our society, and we have to devise policies that will discriminate positively in favor of depressed geographical sections, depressed ethnic sections, and so on, without appearing to be unjust.
One cannot,
and in fact, without being unjust.
Without being unjust.
Yes.
One cannot fault Desmond White for attempting to reach out to all sections. In fact, you've been called Desmond Passat. But I still have to press you on the question. of African Guyanese,
Yeah.
because African Guyanese are in the public sector,
Yes.
and the IMF and World Bank conditionalities affect those people in the public sector.
People on fixed wages.
On
yes,
fixed wages
yes,
more
yes.
than the others.
Yes, yeah.
And so what I want to hear from you is, quite apart from your grand national plan,
yeah.
your particular plan to arrest the deteriorating situation among African Guyanese.
Well, one of the things we had put forward as an election issue as part of our platform was the creation of the spirit of entrepreneurship among people. The thing with, I mean, let's face it, whether for whatever reasons, cultural or what, you find that our Indian citizens tend to be more entrepreneurial than the citizens of African descent. And I think that we have to create the mechanisms for helping young people, which would include a large number of young Black people, to acquire an impulse to be entrepreneurial. I mean, when they leave school, not to say, well, who can employ me? Give me a job, sir, but they want to go out to create businesses for themselves.
How are you going about doing that?
Oh, fine. First of all, you have to start in the schools, and you set up special mechanisms for giving them the formal training. You have to create financial institutions which would provide them with the financial resources they may need. You have to have an outreach program which will help them with the management. You don't tell them start a business and you run away, you leave them. You have to hold their hands for some time through some kind of outreach program. You have to help them with things like marketing, right? And generally consciously create a class of young entrepreneurs, who will then have an opportunity to grow, make wealth, because the making of wealth is not a bad thing or a dirty thing. In the dictionary of the People's National Congress, you want to get people to aspire to build an economic base, which will make them comfortable in their families, and comfortable and so on. So it is a whole program that we have to do to revolutionize people's thinking. And that is one of the things we said we would do, and one of the things we still hope to do. On the other hand, you have organizations like ACTA, which is the African Cultural Development Association. And I talked to some of the people there, and I urged them to do the same kind of thing, So it's something not only for the government, but for the association of Black people and other people who are interested in the development of our country. Because it's not good enough to build a road and to build a school and a hospital and so on if you're not building people. If you're not building people the skills and the drive to really take charge of the country and the economy.
Oh boy. That was me talking there to Desmond Hoyt, former president of Guyana. And that was 1998, 27 years ago. 27 years ago. I sometimes listen to wannabes and the just comes about politics. And they look at some of us and think that, all we do is yap, 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 yap. And the depth of experience that we have accumulated over time, if we weren't just on the streets with placard and shouting and so on, we did a lot of that. But we also did studies of our country. We also had conversations with people who have been consequential And sometimes I like to go into the archives and pull these things out and say, you know, the David Hinds's that you see on social media, they didn't start the story 5 years ago. I had the pleasure of interviewing Desmond Hoyt, I think about 5 times. About 5 times. And the reason I play that interview tonight, or part of it, is, and that interview was done in Washington, D.C. I was the host and still co-host some program of a television program called Carib Nation, which is the longest serving Caribbean program, television program in the United States of America. We've been on air from 1995 to today, 30 years. And I was one of the founding hosts of that program. Since I moved from Washington, D.C., I still, whenever I pass through, sometimes they would ask me to do a special program and so forth. So it was through that program that I got the opportunity to interview Mr. Hoyt. And I had a radio program also in Washington, D.C. area. I interviewed him a couple of times there. But those of you who are the regulars could figure out why I played that interview of 27 years ago. Because the issues that Mr. Hoyt dealt with, the questions I posed to him, are still with us today. Many of them. Let me say this, you know. Mr. Hoyt, is one of the consequential presidents of our country. And I'll tell you why. Burnham took over Guyana in the transition from plantation to nation, from colonialism to independence. And in that sense, he was our first consequential leader, because he took over the country at a time of transition from one order to another order. Desmond Hoyt is the next consequential leader because he governed Guyana at a time of the transition from the Cold War to the post-Cold War era. The end of the Cold War, 1989, it was the end of 40 years of a particular world order that came into being at the end of the Second World War, 1945, when the leaders, the victors of the war, got together in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, and created what became known as the Washington Consensus. And out of the Washington Consensus came the competition between the USSR and the United States, and that competition shaped the world from the 1940s until the end of the 1980s. And so the transition from the Cold War era to the post-Cold War era was a consequential period in world history, and particularly for Guyana and countries like Guyana. We were moving from one world order to another world order. And Guyana and countries like Guyana had to make that transition. The old world order, the one that came into being after the Second World War, was not created for countries like Guyana because Guyana did not exist. We came into being in 1966 as a sovereign country. So that old world order was not created for us. And we had to find our feet within the context of a world order that we did not help to create and that was not created for us. And we had the onerous task of moving from plantation to nation. Our post-colonial government was taking over an old sugar plantation. That's what Guyana was. We were producing wealth for England, and we weren't producing wealth for ourselves. And so when England left formally, they left us with no wealth. There was no need for hospitals and universities and all the things that go with a normal country. We had to find those things for ourselves. That is why post-colonial governments and governments throughout our Caribbean and the wider so-called third world had to spend so much on education, so much on healthcare. Because when we took over, that kind of infrastructure, Mr. Hoyt called it, he says, you know, you can build schools and hospitals and so on. You're going nowhere if you don't build people. And that's what the Burnham government and governments like the Burnham government had to do, was to invest in people. And that is why they had to spend on education, spend on healthcare. In many regards, they were spending more than they were earning. Because when they took over, sugar was king. But the price of sugar began to fall on the world market. So the revenues that were expected from sugar weren't coming in. We got some revenue from bauxite and rice and so on. But we were still a quote-unquote what the economists call a monoculture society. A society that depends on one or two products. And we were competing, we were trying to do all of this in a world that did not take kindly on what we were doing. Although the British had left, the Europeans were gone, they still saw countries like Guyana as plantations. And so they weren't interested in us becoming a viable nation, viable economy. So they were gone, but we were still fighting against their wishes. Remember, they had constructed this world order after the end of the Second World War. And so by the time we get to the 1980s, our experiments in social construction, in developing the human element in our society, we could no longer finance it. We could no longer finance it. The Cold War ends. As David Rudder said, the eagle was sitting on the shoulder of the bear, or is it the other way around? The USSR and the United States, which were polar enemies, they were now united again, as they were at the time of the Washington Consensus. They were now united again in controlling the world, and they were creating a new world order. It would be a new world order that would be governed by the dictates of institutions that were created at the end of the Second World War, the IMF, the World Bank, the World Trade Organization, the United Nations. These are all institutions that were created coming out of Bretton Woods, the Washington Consensus. The Cold War ends, and these institutions are there and say, we are here to construct this new world order. The IMF and the World Bank and the WTO and the structural adjustment. You Guyana, you Barbados, you Jamaica. We are going to take over the running of your economies, and you are going to spend only what you earn. As Michael Mann used to say, I come to you. I say, but a cash trap. My people can't get butter, they can't get rice, they can't get sugar. Give me a short-term loan so I can take care of that problem. And Manley said that, watch him in his face and tell him, that's your problem. That's not our problem. It is against that background that Desmond Hoyt took office. He's taken office at a critical time in world history, at a critical time in Guyana's history, the transformation from one world order to another world order. And that is what I mean by him being a consequential leader. Because he was governing at a consequential time. And it is my argument that when you want to make sense of a country, you go to those periods of consequence. And you study those periods because they tell you a lot. They tell you a lot. Hoyt lost office in 1992 as a consequence of the transition from one order to the next order. America got involved in our politics, in a frontal way in 1992. And where you stand, whether you stood on the PNC side or on the then opposition side, the fact of the matter is that they changed, governmental change we had in 1992 was not solely the result of Guyanese people making conscious choices. It was that plus external intervention. The same with Burnham. Burnham came into office as a consequential time, but it was also as a result of external intervention. The point I'm making here is that at critical points, you have had external interventions. So when one is analyzing the Burnham era, we're analyzing the Hoyt era, we have to look at all the factors that were at play. Local factors or domestic factors, global factors. And I think I've not seen, well, Tyrone Ferguson did a study of the Hoyt era, but since then I've not seen any real serious analysis of the Hoyt period and that transition. And so even when Hoyt lost power in 1992, he still was part and parcel because he was the leader of the opposition at the time when the PPP took office. And they began to take advantage of the openings that came as a result of the global change. And under the radar, they began to put the building blocks in place for what we are seeing today. That is, the PPP came to power in 1992, not because of any tremendous struggle that they alone carried out. The PPP came to power as a result of a convergence of events. Global transition from Cold War to post-Cold War. Internal pressure on the government. And the ethnic nature of our politics. And the PPP was able to come to power. Hoyt is not always credited with the role he played in the transition from a politics of electoral defense to a politics of electoral opening. I'm avoiding that word democracy. Because what we had after 1992 was not democracy. What we had was an opening. And that opening, Hoyt had to be credited with it. Stabrook News, Kaitron News, they came into being as a result of Desmond Hoyt. Free elections, not fair elections, free elections, came as a result of Desmond Hoyt. He went against the wishes of many in his party. And so when the PPP talk about their fight for democracy, you wonder, what are they talking about? The lives that were laid down internally, the Walter Rodneys, Ohini Kwamas, Edward Dublin, the people who went to jail, they're the ones who fought and paid with their lives and their liberty. And Desmond Hoyt was the leader that acquiesced to both internal and external pressures and went with a certain logic. In fact, when the first interview I did with Desmond Hoyt, he said, Mr. Hines, I thought you were in New York. I said, Mr. Hines, you know, Mr. Hoyt, you know me? He said, I know you. And he jokingly said, you know, there's a time when the PNC leadership said it's better to have people like you, the WPA people like you, out of the country than in the country. And both of us laughed, because it was the convergence of the struggles of some of us, the sacrifices of some of us, and the enlightenment of a Desmond Hoyt that caused that democratic opening of 1992. And the PPP benefited from it because it had the critical mass of Indian Guyanese who were voted for it. They were beneficiaries of the struggles of non-PPP people. I don't want to say WPA people, because it wasn't just WPA. There were other so-called civil society people. It was the sacrifices by those of us and the enlightenment of a Desmond Hoyt that led to that opening that the PPP benefited from. So when you hear the PPP talk about they bring back democracy, I'm sorry. That's not true. That is not true. They benefited. And I'm not saying that the PPP did not engage in struggle. They did. But at a given point, the PPP succumbed to the logic of the Communist International. And that is why a number of East Indians then left and went to the WPA, went to DLM, and so on and so forth, because the PPP was not struggling for them. The logic of ethnicity said that once the opening came, the Indians went back to the PPP. But they had left the PPP because the PPP was not fighting for them. These are not things that David Hines is making up. What? It's true. The PPP self-say, there was once a time Walter Rodney and the WPA were powerful. They were admitting their members left and came to us because we were the fighters. And by the way, Walter Rodney died in 1980. The government changed in 1992. In those 12 years, we continue to fight. But Hoyt was an enlightened leader who did not swim against the tide. And so we had that opening. I'm saying that to say that he's a consequential leader, that because of the Jagan-Burnham thing, leaders like Desmond Hoyt don't get the kind of treatment from analysts. Sometimes scholars can be lazy. We go to books that people write and we quote from the books rather than going and do source. Go to the source and talk to people who were there, who were part of the struggle. Go and do source research rather than go gather books that people write and then repeat what people wrote. And so what happens is that people do books on Guyana and it becomes Burnham versus Jagan, Indian versus African, full stop. Nothing else matters. But we are not going to make sense of that period of Guyana's history if we don't study in part the Desmond Hoyt phenomenon. We talked about race. We talked about race and entrepreneurship. We talked about governance in a multi-ethnic society. So here we are in 2025. Here we are in 2025. And we are at another consequential period. The transition of Guyana from a post-plantation society to a petro-state. A third consequential era. And we are not going to make sense of all of this. And we are not going to make sense of what we are seeing if we don't make sense of the Burnham era, the Hoyt era. Sometimes, as I said, people look at you today. I'm a big man in my 60s. But I started doing politics when I was 15. And what you see today is not what always used to be. Somebody said back then I had hair 20-something years ago. And I've said on this program, they did a profile of me for Black History Month. Sister Michelle Joseph, and people said, well, we didn't know this and we didn't know that. GHK Lal was here and he said he didn't know that we worked with the PPP. And I tell the story of my classmate, Sir McGarrell. He went on to become a headmaster. He was one of the first agri-science expert as a teacher. And I think he did a lot of consultant work after then. But he like all of us, Henry Rodney, myself, we started life doing drama. People like Colin Burke and so on. We started in our village. And so McGarrell and I, and there was a young drummer we call him Busty. I'm trying to remember Busty name. You know, you grew up in a village and you know people by their false name and you know the real name. But the three of us went to Freedom House and went to Gale to share. They had a drama group and we said, look, we can act and we can beat drum and we want to help the cause of national unity. We feel that when you all are going in to Indian areas, if they see some black people with you all on stage, it's going to help national unity. We were WPA people. We didn't go and go to the PPP and say, well, you know, give us so much money and we're coming over to you. We never asked to join the PPP. Gale to Share never asked us to join the PPP. We were doing a national cause. I'm telling that story to make sense, help to make sense of the present. Because some people are looking us straight in our face and say that they're interested in national unity and they got to go and join the PPP. And not realize how backward and stupid that is. That there is a template that if you want national unity, you don't have to leave your house, lock up your house, or break up your house and go over into another man's house. You stay in your house, he in his house, and you all fight for the community, fight for the country. There's a template. And that is what I mean when I talk about the colliding of resistance and enlightenment. So when you look at me interviewing Desmond Hoyt, that is what you saw there. That whereas Hoyt was on one side of the political divide, people like myself were on the other side of the political divide. There were charges and counter charges. There were casualties. People were murdered. People went to jail. But yet, we could sit there and talk. We could sit there and talk. And so we come to this present, this consequential period that we are trying to make sense of. This transition from a plantation economy to a petro state. And all the unfinished business of the previous two eras are transferred here. How I would have loved a Desmond Hoyt and his enlightenment at a critical period. Y'all see where I'm going? Hoyt had power. He could have held on to that power. He could have made deals with the Americans and stay in power, but he chose enlightenment. The PPP has power as we are transitioning. And they have a chance to choose the enlightenment of a Desmond Hoyt, or to choose the lawless, backward, and autocratic option. Whereas Hoyt agreed to a new voters list in 1990. The PPP is fighting against a new voters list in 2025. Whereas Hoyt agreed to the counting of votes at the place of polling, the PPP is disagreeing and fighting against biometrics. Whereas Hoyt agreed to ending overseas voting, the PPP in 2025 are encouraging fraudulent overseas voting. Nancy, story. Who been there? Who been there? Me been there. I was there. Let me repeat. Whereas Hoyt went against overseas voting, the PPP is embracing overseas voters being used, their ID cards being used by people for voter impersonation. Whereas Hoyt agreed to an extension of 2 years to get the proper voters list, the PPP is fighting tooth and nail against the voters list. And what is not known is that the WPA proposed in 1990, after the elections were postponed, in order that we can get the clean voters list and other reforms. We suggested to the PPP that we should approach Desmond Hoyt and ask that the period 1990 to whenever the election was going to be called, that we have a national unity government. And that since Hoyt was already there as president, that he should remain as president, but that the PPP and the WPA and the PNC and others form a national government. The PPP said Hoyt will never agree to it. And when the WPA met with Hoyt, I remember Justice Messiah, who was then, I think he must have been the Attorney General, but he was in the hierarchy of the PNC and he was part of the delegation. When the WPA met with Hoyt, Hoyt agreed. Hoyt agreed to a national government. He said he agreed that he should not, since this is extra 2 years, he alone should not govern. He should govern with a national government. That included the PPP, the WPA and other forces, so-called small parties. We went back to the PPP and the PPP said they're not interested. So whereas Hoyt was for national unity and a national government in 1990, in 2025, the PPP is for one-party domination. How much clearer can it be? There is no enlightenment that is coming from the PPP. Hoyt had a sense of where the world was. And he had a sense of Guyana's place in that world. And at the front of his mind was the survival of our national experiment as a country. And he was prepared to sit with his proverbial political enemies for the nation to survive. This PPP is breaking down all the guardrails. They have no sense of the historical motion of the moment and Guyana's place. They're prepared to destroy Guyana. So we are at this transition, a third transition. The first transition from colonialism to independence, the second transition from Cold War to post-Cold War, and the third transition from a structural adjustment era to a petro-state era. and the PPP has been found wanting. Our country is at the edge. Internal conflict. Remember how it use the word conflict? You all understand why I played that interview? Somebody texted me to say Busty name was Alexander Bustamante. That was his first name. So the Busty came from Bustamante. Those were his two names. Our people had a sense of history. Because the Jamaican leader, one of them, at the time of independence, you had Norman Manley and Alexander Bustamante. And our people gave our children the names. Alexander Bustamante. Let me see what they say. Holder. Yes, that's what Busty was. Alexander Bustamante Holder. God bless the dead. And so we are at this era. Where the PPP is making all the wrong choices. No enlightenment. No sense of Guyana's place in the world. They're prepared to gamble Guyana away. The vultures are at our western border. The multinational corporations are in our waters. Exploiting our oil resources. 50% of our people are impoverished. 50% of our secondary school children are dropping out of school by the time they're ready to write exam. 4% of our primary school children, you don't get drop out at primary school. But we, 4% of dropout. 50% of our people are earning $505.50 American dollars per day. That is $27 a week. That's 108 American dollars a month. Translate that in Guyana money. That's between $20,000 and $25,000 a month. 50% of our population. The IMF says that, not me. I didn't invent those numbers. Our young people are killing themselves on the road. Blackout, hours upon hours. Fires every day. And yet the PPP is telling us in this era of transition that they're developing Guyana. What development are they talking about? Tomorrow, Mr. Jack Dio is going to sit down on his bucket of shit, as he call it. And he's going to tell us about what the IMF says. The IMF is doing its job. The IMF knows of the blackout. The IMF knows that our young people are killing themselves on the road every day. The IMF knows of the 50% dropout. The IMF knows of the 4% dropout at primary school. The IMF knows that 50% of our people are working for next to nothing. The IMF knows that teachers and public servants who are certified are working for depressed wage. The IMF knows that. But when the IMF does its report, it doesn't take that into consideration. Because the IMF was not created to do that kind of analysis. It is not the IMF is not aware. Although we are no longer on an IMF program, and it's not just we, not just Guyana, Jamaica, Barbados, all of them. Although we are not officially on an IMF program, we are doing what the IMF would have wanted us to do. And once we satisfy those conditionalities, the IMF is okay. Remember when the IMF came in 1992, it said, look, cut government spending. But government spend money on education and healthcare. No, we are not, that's your problem. Cut government spending. Privatize. 80% of the economy was in government hands. And some of us fought against that at the time. We felt government, 80% all belong, because the IMF come and say, privatize. 2025. More than 80% of the economy is in private hands. And 90% of that in private hands are in the economic elite of one race. Jeffrey was here last night. 10%, sorry, the Indian share of contracts is 10 times that of Africans. 10 times. In the United States, the average white family earns 8 times more than the average black family. And that is a scandal of the century. In Guyana, one race, East Indian, the economic elites of the East Indian, they have 10 times, not 8 times, 10 times more of the economy than Africans. One is 30% of the population. The other one is, they say now 36 or 38% of the population. In America, black people represent 12 or 13% of the population. White people represent 70% of the population. And they are 8-1, and we scream about that. And in Guyana, where the two ethnicities are about the same, one has 10 times more wealth. I mean, the wealth is with the economic elite, not the ordinary Indians. But, you know, trickle-down happens along racial lines in Guyana. So more is going to trickle down to the Indian poor than the black. If you get a mash of money going on and you want to finance your float, and you're African Guyanese, only 10% of the wealth is in the hands of your people. You gotta go to Indians and ask for, Indian business people, and ask for donation. For decades, the Indian business community held the PNC at ransom because the PNC had to go to them for donation. There's not a black entrepreneurial, a big black entrepreneurial class to finance a black party. See the contradictions? So the IMF report that Mr. Jack Dio will talk about tomorrow, again, is to pull wool over our eyes. The IMF report is a minimalist report. That is the charge of the IMF. I'm not saying the IMF is stupid. The IMF has an objective, and their report will reflect their objective. Our objective is to go where the IMF is not going to go, and to supplement the IMF report. What Hoyt calls, he said you can build bridge and you can build hospital and road, and the IMF is praising the PPP for that. But as I said, if you don't build people, the IMF is not necessarily about human development. It took a long time when the IMF came with structural adjustment in the 1990s for them to okay a survival project. I think it was called CMAP or something like that. The leaders had to tell them, look, man, this thing that is medicine that you're all giving me, causing all kind of trouble, all kind of side effects. Our people are suffering. We got to knock off all set of people. Thank God, a lot of the public servants who get knocked off, they went into trading. And it was only then that they put an amelioration program in place. I think it's CMAP it was called. So the IMF gaze is a limited gaze. But we have to put the broader gaze. There is no development in Guyana. I go back to my old partner. Well, not my partner. He's a big man for me, so I shouldn't call him partner. Dr. Wilfred David, Eldorado Belladrum man. I was a small boy listening to radio. He was then an economic advisor to the PNC to Burnham. And I heard him on the radio talk about growth without development. And it didn't make a lot of sense to me. I was a little by 12, 13. You know what growth means. You had a sense that development wasn't growth. But that stuck with me. And so we're having growth without development. You cannot be a developed country and get in the among the blackout we get in. You cannot be a developed country and have half of your people living in poverty. You cannot be a developed country and half of your children in high school dropping out before they can write the exam. You cannot be a developed country. Not even a developing country with those wars. Why are we still producing sugar at way above what other people are producing? Other people are producing for 12 and 13 cents, we're producing for 40 cents. And we can sell it. Why are we subsidizing the buyers of our sugar in England? Aren't we still in a colonial relationship? Oh, yes, we are. How can we be a developed country where we can even build roads properly? Rather than building modern roads, we come back to concrete pathways. What kind of confounded nonsense are you telling us? We have growth without development. And that growth can be compromised if, as Trump and others are saying, drill, baby, drill, and the price of oil on the world market gone down. The growth will go down. We are vulnerable. We are borrowing like crazy. And governments must borrow. You all don't get me wrong here now. Often what governments do is they borrow against expected income. And of course, we have a windfall coming in because of oil. But like I said, that windfall could decrease because it's vulnerable to the vagaries, is vulnerable to what's going on in the world market. And so although we should borrow because we get assets expected to come in, because of what's happening in the world, we have to be very careful about how much we are borrowing. And in any case, when you borrow, that's not the problem. Do you have the capacity to pay back? And secondly, what are you spending the money that you are borrowing on? If you spend the money that you're borrowing on liquor, you will get drunk. That's why they say you spend like a drunken sailor. Right? If you spend the money that you borrow on rum, you'll get drunk. If you spend the money that you're borrowing on food for the body and food for the mind, education, as we would say, education. The PPP is failing us where it matters. And they want to continue in power at all costs. There's no enlightenment. And that is why we have to get them out of the way. And we have to say to those on the opposition side, this morning I get vexed on Kidaki show and I said the depth stupidness. Every time you open the paper to read anything about coalition, presidential candidate. I'm not saying that they should not negotiate who the presidential candidate should be. I'm not saying that. But why should our people who are waiting for marching orders for an election that is a couple of months ago have to sit down and wait until these two parties figure out presidential candidate? And I can take me party out of it because we're not in that. Your people are waiting for marching orders. Marching orders against those who don't want biometrics and a clean voters list, who have captured GCOM. Your people are waiting on marching orders to begin to put them psychologically, to put their psyche and ready to go and put that X in the right place. And every time you open the paper, presidential candidate. And then my friend Nigel had to say there's no problem in the coalition. Yes, there's no problem in the coalition. But go tell that to the people out there who are saying since last year, August, when you all went to Buxton, and I stood in between you all and put you all up in the air. You all should have figured out you are presidential candidate the next day. 7 months later, you all still on nonsense. I got there because I was saying there's no enlightenment coming from the PPP. And the burden of making this transition right is now on the present opposition. But where is the confidence that they are passing down to our people? I hope they take into the spirit that I am saying it. There are times in history when you have the luxury of putting party over people and over nation. There are times in history you have that luxury. This is not a time. This is a time where you have to merge the imperatives of the party with the imperatives of the time and the imperatives of your people's expectation. Merge them I'm not saying that there must not be partisan concerns. I belong to a political party and we do have partisan concerns. But nobody can charge us with putting those concerns over the imperatives of the time. Come on, guys. Buck up. This is not just about you all. You all can get the best presidential candidate. If you lose the damn elections, your people are deeper, deeper, deeper in the mess. Tonight, I had to get this off my chest. All that I said tonight, because we want to open it up clear for our people to see. And I was on Kidaki this morning and he wanted me to talk about Muhammad. And I said, I don't want to talk about Muhammad. I want to talk about our people. I want to talk about my country. I don't want to talk about Muhammad. Muhammad can talk for himself. I don't care about Muhammad and GRA. Muhammad get book of money, he can buy GRA tomorrow if he want. Why the hell must I be talking about Muhammad tax thing? Me and bringing in Ferrari, 99.9999999% of the people I'm bringing in Ferrari. Muhammad won't fight for me. Why I must fight for Muhammad? Muhammad is in a class by himself. But yet some of our people are into the Muhammad nonsense. And that's not my interest. I am not fighting against Muhammad because Muhammad is not the government. It is not Muhammad I'm trying to remove from power. I'm not fighting for Muhammad because Muhammad got resources. Some of it should have come to the Guyanese people. You don't give Muhammad buku resources and then he come and he's sharing out some to people and you say, oh, what a wonderful person he is. In the first place, he should not have all those resources. My people, you all get sense. It's your own money Muhammad giving back to you. And you all jumping that he's some God and Savior. Well, not you all. Some, a tiny minority. You all got to understand the tree from the forest, man. Muhammad can afford to go around and build a house here and build a house there and so on. He can afford it. If this government was for you all and not the Mohammeds of the world, that money would have come to you all. Not 100,000, where by the time you spin around and buy, stack up little food and buy the shoe that your picnic always want, the $100,000 done. So I'm not interested in Muhammad. If Muhammad want to go in and fight election, there is his business. If Muhammad and the PPP cussing Martin, that's their business. The government is the PPP. The PPP is the one that is bringing down hardship on our people. Keep our eyes on the ball. Like an eagle. And don't be caught up in distractions. Let the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable in thy sight. By the rivers of Babylon, where we sat down. And there we wept when we remember Zion. For the wicked carry us away captivity. Required from us a strange, strange song. But how can we sing a strange song? How can we sing a strange song? Tell me, how can we sing a strange song? Tomorrow night, Vincent Alexander is going to be here to keep my company, and you all know what we're going to be talking about. Again.